Hey, what's going on, everyone? Here we go, working on Sub-Zero. I had a lot of fun working on this artwork. And before I even start coloring, you can see that I've drawn in the character in pencils. I use a 3mm Pentel pencil to draw on the outlines. And for those highlights that you see that I've drawn on the paper, that's a white Charcoal Journal's white pencil. You can get those on Amazon. So I always start off with the face. Here you go, I'm working in the base tones. I'll start off with, well, he's a very, has a lot of cool colors, Sub-Zero. So on his skin, I start off with like a medium blue, and then I'll start adding a few little darks, and then usually at the last part I add highlights. As you can see, towards the end of the working on the portrait, I'm adding the highlights, and those I do with the Charcoal Journal's white pencils. So now, we're going to start working on the head part. And here we go. I've worked in the fine details, the little lines and textures that he has. And then I'll just gradually start working in layering, layer by layer, the darks, the midtones, the highlights, and just working around the head, getting in some of those highlights. Sometimes I like putting in highlights first because it gives me a guide to where I'm going to work next. So that works a lot of times for you. And as you can see, this time I started with some of the blue highlights, and I've added the medium blue tones on top of that. And now here we go on, getting on to the mask. I'm drawing in the fine lines with a black Carbothello pencil. Those I like because the Carbothellos I'll use for fine details, because you can get the pencils pretty sharp and you can really get into those little small areas. And then as you can see, for a lot of the larger sections, I'll use my Caran pencils because they're a lot softer and they're easier to blend. You'll see gradually through the painting that I use my blender, my blending stump, and then I use a number 4 blending stump for getting those for getting it nice and buttery smooth blends. So here I am adding the white highlights on top of the darks. Now this is what I like about pastel pencils, is that when you're painting like with oils, for instance, or acrylics, it's a little bit harder getting those highlights on top after the paint has dried. But with pastel pencils, the white goes right on top of the black. As you can see in the mask, you can see how I did a lot of darks and then I added the white little highlights right on top, and it's really easy and it really makes it pop. That's why I like using pastel pencils, because they're easy to blend, they're easy to work with, and I do prefer them over colored pencils, because I've tried colored pencils and man, those things are so waxy. They're hard to blend and it's hard on your wrist. I mean, you can blend them, but you're using a lot. You got to do, I would say, 10 times more blending than when you're doing with pastels. Because when you're working with pastels, not oil pastels, okay? I'm talking about soft pastels and hard pastels. They go on buttery smooth if you're using a good paper. Like the paper I use is a pastel mat and it has a tooth on it. So when you use those pastels, that tooth, it grabs it. Because these pencils, they're very soft. So when you're working with it, it's like buttery smooth when you lay those colors down. And so when you take your blender and you move right on top of it, it just blends so easy. And it's easy on the wrist. Especially when you're doing a lot of detail work like I do. Because these paintings take me like about 50 hours to 100 hours, depending on the size. So here I am working on Sub-Zero's shoulder pad, and I think I did the darks. I did a darks, and then I worked dark to light on this part. Now there's no right or wrong way when you're working with pastels, because sometimes I work dark to light, and sometimes I work light to dark, or sometimes I'll even start with the mid-tones and go from mid-tone to dark, and then I'll add highlights on top of it. I work very unorthodox. I don't follow the rules, what they say you're supposed to work. Once you get to a certain level, you can do what works best for you because you've tried everything and you know what works best. So here we are working on his chest armor piece, and I'm working in, as you can see, I'm doing a lot of the darks first because those darks are giving me a guide to where I need to work next. So I'm filling in those darks with the black pencil, the Carbothello pencil, and I'm doing midtones right after. So I'm doing the darks, and then I'm doing the mid-tone blues, And then after that, I'll start adding the highlights in. And this works best for this area, this particular area. And don't get overwhelmed when you're working on your pieces. You know, they will get finished. Always remember that Rome wasn't built in a day. You know, if you want to get high quality work with a lot of detail, you got to do section at a time. You know, I always prefer quality over quantity. That's what I always tell myself. That's why it takes me several days to a week to 2 weeks to finish one piece. So here we go, working on some of the mist or the cold air coming off of his ice blade. And as you can see, I left that area kind of blank. So I'm adding the highlights, or I'm adding the tones later on after I did the armor piece. So here's the mist coming off the sword. And now we're just finishing up some little areas around the hand, some little black areas. Now, as you see, I'm working on his skin tones. He's very blue. It's very cool tones. So I'm not even using any flesh tones. This is all blues. Dark blue, medium blue, and light blues. And then as you can see for the tips of the fingers, I'm using pure white. Do not use pure white too much because it's very strong. And when you keep it to a minimum, it makes the artwork pop out more. Same with the blacks. If you're going to use blacks on the skin, keep it very minimal. As you can see, I only use the blacks in between his fingers where the darkest shadows were. Okay? And I use blacks on the dark parts of his armor. But when you're working on skin tones, you barely have to use black. Because if you use too much black on skin tone, it's going to make it look muddy and dirty and it just won't look right. So here I am working on finishing his arm piece. And I'm doing the little text. I do I block in the large areas first. And then on top of that, I'll start adding in a few more highlights, and then I'll start adding the fine details. You see how I'm doing those little tiny detailed textures? You always want to do that after you've blocked in that area first. And here we are just working on his gauntlets. And these were super detailed. These took some time. So I'm just working in small, fine details, some of the highlights. And on this one, I did do some of the highlights first. These are some of the little ring attachments on his gauntlets. And like I said, I even blend with my fingers sometimes. But don't blend too hard. I use both. I use my finger, I use my pinky, and then I'll use a blending stump. And sometimes when you use your finger, it's a lot softer. But sometimes when you need to blend a little bit harder, you use the blending stump. So I'm working on the belt piece, and there's a lot of little woven strands that I'm going to be doing piece by piece. Now, do you see how I blocked in that entire area first? And then I'm drawing in the strands. And then after I draw in the strands, you see I'm adding the highlights. That's the easiest way to do it. Block in, okay, get your major colors finished first, then take the black pencil and then do your little strands and then do the highlights on top of that. Now for the ice sword, because it was such a large area, I just painted it in with white gesso. White Liquitex acrylic gesso. And now I'm adding the light blues on top of that. And then after I start adding all those little light blues, I'll start adding whites on that, because that's where I get my textures. Okay, here's something interesting. I'm using the pan pastel for the background. This saves you a lot of time using the pan pastels. Those are my application tools. Because these are large areas and you can blend super easy. No one wants to do a large area like this with pencils. That would take you forever to blend. And the tools that I'm using, it's almost like a sponge. So you kind of sponge it right out of the palette and just wipe it on the paper. And the background didn't take me too long on this one, maybe like 3 hours. As you can see, I'm using a stencil for some of the snow, not a lot. But most of it, I just hand drew the snow in. Also on the snow part, I'm barely using any white, even though it looks white. I'm using a very light blue. So make sure you block in that entire area first and make sure it's the right color and it's exactly how you want it to look. Because once you start adding that snow on top of that, you don't want to have to go back and rework that cold wind and the clouds. I'm adding a few more cold mist coming off of the sword, and then a few more a little bit more snowflakes. But yeah, there it is. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Hey, what's going on everyone? Thanks for checking out my video of Sub-Zero. I had a lot of fun working on this piece, and it didn't take me too long to complete. I was surprised. It only took me about 3 or 4 days. And I think it's because this artwork was more like organic. As you can see from his costume, a lot of organic pieces. It's not really too hard to draw. Like when you start getting into robots and metal parts, metal pieces, there's a lot of symmetry involved. So you have to be very precise when you're doing the line work, which takes a lot longer, like for instance doing straight edges and things like that. So yeah, this one is the partner piece or sister piece to Scorpion. As you can see, I got Scorpion right here, and they're meant to be displayed together. So I think it came out pretty good. Like I said in the Scorpion video, I kept this one warm with warm colors because of the fire. The Sub-Zero I kept the exact opposite, in the cool colors with a lot of blues. So you've got kind of two complementary colors which look good displayed together. But yeah, I used my supplies, which I always like telling you guys real quick. The Caran pastel pencils. I choose pastel pencils over colored pencils, and I do recommend them over colored pencils because they're a lot easier to work with. Personally, I find that colored pencils are very waxy and they're extremely hard to blend. You gotta have a lot of wrist power, like blending. It's a lot. Now with pastels, they swipe on like butter, super easy on the wrist, and you just take a blending stump and you can just blend like super easy. That's why I prefer these. But anyways, yeah, that's just a little short information on the Sub-Zero. I want to thank you guys again for checking out the channel. You can really help the channel out by liking, subscribing, and if you want to be updated when I post new videos, just hit the notification bell. But anyways, yeah, thanks a lot. We'll see you in the next video.